It's easier to deal with something when it's not a big surprise. It's a lot easier. We understand ahead of time, much like the used car. I know I'm going to have to put some money into it to fix it up, to use it the way I want. Plan for it ahead of time, and we can be here to help guide that.
From cornfields to high-rises, office to industrial, houses to hotels, and every other asset class in real estate, we cover the people, the projects, and the profit. Welcome to the Investing in Iowa show. This show is for go-doers, action takers, and business owners. It's for people like you who are sick of Uncle Sam taking a huge bite of your apple. If you're looking to get ahead of what's taking place in Iowa, learn who is doing what and how you can get in on the action, you're in the right place. Hosted by Mel Pins, an Iowa native who has been involved in over $300 million in real estate right here in Iowa. Recording in studio from West Des Moines. Here's your host, Mel Pins.
I've got Mel Pins here on this show. Mel, welcome.
Good afternoon, Neil. Glad to be with you today.
Excited you're here. Say, for the audience to say, who are you? Where are you from? What do you do?
Sure. Well, again, Mel Pins, kind of a Des Moines area native, but I'm an urban planner by degree. But I've spent all of my 30-plus year career working with environmental regulations. The last 20 of that has been at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. And at the DNR, I help developers, landowners, buyers, purchasers with questions I have about environmental liability. I actually have some assistance that I can provide to local governments and nonprofits with some grants, but it's kind of a topic that most people don't like to talk about, but I certainly love to talk about it if people have questions.
You and I connected here a few months back. I heard you speak at a breakfast at ICREA.
Sure.
And as we were rolling out the show, I thought Mel's got to come on because what you shared there, and we're going to certainly get into a whole bunch of it today, is I think of tremendous value to those who buy real estate in Iowa. Whether you think you have an environmental problem or you don't, you need to have an understanding about what are some of the risks out there, what are some of the pitfalls, and what you should be doing as proper buyer due diligence through the process.
Sure.
Let's start here. Is there any sort of environmental due diligence that the state even requires for a buyer when they purchase a property?
That's a fundamental question. It's a good one. There's a lot of assumptions with that. Basically, the simple answer is no. You can buy, sell, and trade real estate all day long in the state of Iowa. The DNR does not require any kind of environmental assessment prior to property transactions. The only thing there is in state law is what's called the groundwater hazard statement. And it's been around for decades. Everybody sees it. Sometimes it's been a check the box, move it on. But the fundamental behind that is in Iowa law, a seller is required to disclose any known information that they have as their common knowledge about any weird things that might be present on the site, like any old landfills or dumps, any underground storage tanks, any wells or cisterns, or by golly, even a buried body, like literally. Are there any graves on the property? But it's only to the best of their knowledge. So if I have a warehouse that's been around 80 years and I'm going to sell it, on the groundwater hazard statement, it used to be you fill out a form and you said, nope, don't know about that. And you turned it over to the seller. They looked at it for a few seconds and you moved on. Now, there have been some changes to simplify that process. About 3 years ago, the Iowa legislature made some changes. It used to be no matter what the transaction was, whether it was a house, an empty lot, a garage, or an industrial site, the whole groundwater hazard statement form and document had to be completed and recorded as part of that deed transfer. That was a lot of paperwork, taking up a lot of space at the county recorder.
Sure.
So they changed the state law. If you're not aware of any of these kind of issues, there's some boilerplate language that goes into the transfer deed and it just says, we're not aware of anything, and you're done. If there are issues to disclose, then you do complete the form, and that form is recorded. But that is the fundamental in Iowa law for anything related to environmental disclosure.
That's it.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, there's a big difference between, yes, so then nothing else is really required, but there's certainly a time and a place where people may want to say, hey, I want to look a little closer before I buy this property. And generally with commercial properties, there's going to be a lender or an investor or maybe somebody's getting a loan through the Small Business Administration, they may have, and they do have requirements. They're like, yes, you will start with what's commonly known as a phase 1 environmental site assessment.
Yep.
And that's also a big misnomer. People say, well, I did a phase 1 and I sampled for this and that. And I'm like, no, you didn't do a phase 1 then.
Right.
A phase 1 is just the resume of the site's history. How has it been developed? Are there any known environmental records on it or nearby it? Kind of like your medical history report, your FICO score.
Yep.
But if a phase 1 would say, well, this used to be a mercury thermometer factory in the 1950s, just like at the doctor's office, here is what my history is. Now we have an idea, or you would have an idea of what maybe you should look for. That's called a phase 2. And that's subject to the buyer and the seller negotiating that. Certain sellers may say, no, take it as it is. Other sellers may say, well, if I want to move this in the marketplace for a decent price, I'm going to have to let them check this out. So I would want to sample soil and groundwater for mercury if I was going to buy the old thermometer factory.
That's right.
Yeah.
So a phase 1, from the state's perspective, DNR's perspective, this is all done in the private industry. DNR is not involved in this. You're not issuing phase 1s. It's a private company going and completing a phase 1 who's ultimately hired either by the buyer or for the benefit of the buyer. Maybe the lender requires that and they're going to hire it done.
Right. That's a great observation on that too. Yeah, the DNR doesn't do phase 1s. We don't review phase 1s. For more than 30 years, there's been a national standard on how a phase 1 is to be conducted. There's what's called an ASTM standard. Just like you buy a piece of lumber or a piece of PVC pipe at the home improvement store, ASTM number, you know how it was built to what quality. Same thing for conducting a phase 1. It's done to an ASTM standard. And an environmental consulting firm or an environmental engineering firm, they should know what that ASTM standard is. If they don't deal with them. A phase 1 is not done by just interviewing the owner about what they know. It's not done on the back of a notepad. It's a very defined process because it's supposed to lead that consultant to, do we know of any environmental conditions that are obvious through records or just visually observing the site? Or even based on the history of the site, do we then recommend to confirm or deny it? And that's what we call a phase 2 site assessment.
In a phase 2, you're going to come out, you're taking soil samples. What type of either user or buyer, they're buying a particular site.
Sure.
At what point do you typically see that phase 2 being done? Some of the things like if you're going to develop, you want to know what that soil is.
Exactly.
You're going to turn that ground over.
Yes.
If there used to be a gas station there, which would typically be revealed in phase 1, you're going to want to know.
Right. Most of the time, the thing that would trigger you should probably check this site out with real sampling. Certainly if the site has already been developed with any kind of intensive industrial or commercial activities that either used or generated hazardous materials. So easy examples, a gas station site, whether it was there 10 years ago or is still operating today. Dry cleaners. For years and decades, the kind of solvents that were used, they're very volatile. In other words, they get out, they react. They can also be hazardous to our health if, there's gross quantities. So dry cleaning locations, automotive facilities of any type, and certainly manufacturing industrial that handles that kind of stuff. Most of the time, let's say if it's a mini storage unit that's 20 years old and it was built on a cornfield, the phase 1's probably going to say, hey, there was nothing here before. The use is innocuous. And again, sometimes what's around it is just as important as the site itself. Because contamination in groundwater can move or emanate over to your site. So you want to hope that such sites are what we call down gradient from you. Sure. They're down the hill, so things don't roll uphill. But those are the kinds of past uses or industries that are common that would probably have that consultant recommending a phase 2 to confirm or deny contaminants.
Yep. No, that makes sense. I'm going to go down a couple of different paths. I'm going to give you one ownership.
Sure.
So the scenario is, I own a building, I own a property. Now all of a sudden it has moved downstream and I happen to be downstream. What's my liability? What's my exposure? What am I supposed to do? What happens?
This is the sophomore level of the course. That's a good question. So if you've got a situation where you didn't cause a contamination. So in your example, it's upgrading. It was uphill for me, but it's coming down. So you didn't cause it. So you can't be made to clean it up. But there's always a big but with these things. Or I should say, however, if you are aware of a condition, you can't continue to cause any undue exposures by others. So we had a situation in I'll just say a college town in Iowa where there was an apartment complex and there had been an upgradient site and there was some releases heading that way. So the apartment building, they put in what we call a vapor mitigation system. They wanted to make sure any vapors that came out of the groundwater through the soil that were getting in the lower levels, that was vented out, much like a radon venting system. Not necessarily all that expensive or intrusive, but because they knew there was an impact, they didn't want to cause any, certainly even potential health risks to those renters, tenants, occupants. Yeah. So it's kind of a due care approach, and federal law does recognize that. But in general, you can't be made to clean up anything as long as you don't cause undue exposures or make it worse through your own activity.
Got it. All right. So new scenario.
Sure.
I buy an old property. It's a gas station, right? It clearly has been a gas station. The convenience store, let's call it, still there. I'm going to turn it into a little trinket shop.
Sure.
What happens? What do I do? What's my exposure from that regard?
Yeah, that's another good scenario. The first one is knowledge is power. So with your phase one, if you started with it, you would have found out, okay, it was a gas station. DNR was very involved. The huge majority of sites we deal with, everybody thinks they get cleaned up where they're perfectly clean, no impact whatsoever. That's a misnomer. Sites are cleaned up or risk evaluated to the point if there's no risk, then why do further cleanup? There's not an endless supply of money, and some cleanups would cost more than the property would ever be worth. So a lot of old gas stations, with the building sitting where it does, with utilities where they are, oftentimes the DNR will sign off as no further action as is. So if you want to move in and set up a trinket shop in the same building and you don't really change anything, no new exposure, no real risk, but it's kind of like a used car. It's not perfect. It's not brand new, but if you take care of it properly, it can still work just fine and you'll get a good value out of it, probably for a lower price, just like a used car. Yeah. That's the fundamental with that. But if you wanted to really change that side around.
Let's go further. Yeah. I want to turn this trinket shop into whatever, a 3-story apartment complex. I'm going to put a few things up. Now what?
A little different scenario.
Sure.
So like we discussed earlier, if you're going to cause new exposures or disturb contaminants, now you have to think through that one. So you would want to evaluate where is the soil contamination? Where is the groundwater contamination? So some people with new structures, they put in what we call a vapor barrier, pretty much like a big plastic tarp that's even underneath the foundational cement. So any vapors that would emanate upwards, they're vented to the outside of the building, or they have contingency plans if they dig up contaminated soil. You can't just throw it in somebody else's backyard. Right. You're going to have to take it to a proper landfill for treatment or disposal. So again, you can plan through these things. And like anything in life, it's easier to deal with something when it's not a big surprise. It's a lot easier. We understand ahead of time, much like the used car. I know I'm going to have to put some money into it to fix it up, to use it the way I want, plan for it ahead of time. And we can be here to help guide that. That's what the DNR can help you with, is that planning, that step-by-step.
Yep.
Hi, it's Ava Baukamp, the Investment Relations Manager for Neil's firm, Legacy Impact Investors. I'm inviting you to join us for our next investor workshop, our monthly Legacy briefings. In these tactical Zoom calls, we cover topics and case studies for subjects such as taxes and depreciation, navigating macroeconomic shifts, and evaluating deals as a passive investor. At each virtual workshop, we are joined by an industry guest who covers their topic in 45 minutes or less. No fluff, no pitches, just education and conversation with an expert each month. Every workshop ends with live Q&A from Neil and our guest. All briefings happen on the last Tuesday of the month at 3 p.m. Central. If you can't make it live, recordings are sent out exclusively to those who've registered in advance. To join us on the last Tuesday of this month, visit legacybriefing.com. Go to legacybriefing.com to register. If you're a first-time registrant, I'll send you a free resource at sign up. Head to legacybriefing.com and I'll see you soon.
Where do you see people, maybe you got a story or two, where do you see people certainly who get it right, they follow this process as you're lining out, the people who get it wrong? What are some of the stories that you've seen that you're going, if you just follow the path A, it doesn't lead to the outcome of path B?
Yep. So yeah, kind of not necessarily a huge horror story, but we did have a business guy and He wanted to buy an old gas station and demolish it and build a new building. Great idea. He looked up the DNR records. We have a public database of any site we've been involved with. He saw that the old gas station had what's called a no further action certificate, an NFA. And for those familiar with those terms, some people believe an NFA means, oh, the site's all clean again. No, an NFA just means under our risk review, as is, there's no outstanding risk. So in our example, buy the existing gas station with an NFA, put a trinket shop. You're not changing anything. No big deal. In this case, they decided to just go full bore. They tore the building down. They dug a big hole in the middle of the site somewhere else for a foundation of a 3-story building, came up with a lot of stinky dirt, green, gray colored dirt, smelled like when the gasoline truck's unloading at your local convenience store. Don't light a match. Somebody called the DNR because it stunk. Yep. And so the DNR came out and we said, hey, you dug up all this contamination. You got to deal with it now. Yep. And the property owner developer was very upset because they thought there was an NFA. They didn't understand what the NFA meant. I guess you could say contingencies or the situation of the site itself. They just saw an NFA on a line and thought they were good as gold. Yep. So it cost them a little bit more money. I think it was like $30,000. Now that, of course, on the pro forma, well, that's another cost. Yep. But once they understood how to deal with it, they dealt with it, continued on with the construction, and they have a great project today. So that's kind of the horror story side. Yeah. But the other side, again, is with good planning ahead of time. Some people do have experience with this. A lot of developers say, hey, this environmental stuff, it's just part of the process. It's just like running the business model. If you're trying to figure out how much can you get per square foot on leasing? Right. I know nothing about that. Right. But you already, as a broker, realtor, developer, you're running numbers on things that are risks for you. And if those risks look okay, you can work this environmental stuff and in essence manage or mitigate that risk. You don't have to run away. But we usually fear what we don't know. Correct. Yeah. So a lot of people that are great professionals like you and your clients, sometimes they might go, I don't want to mess with that. Right. And they leave these sites behind. And I describe those sites as what we call brownfields. It's just a general descriptor term, but they're sites where people have left them sit latent or vacant. Think dirty, dingy, rusty, tarnished. That's a brownfield. So it's easier to go out to maybe an undeveloped suburban farm field and build new than to work through these questions step by step to get to your project.
Is there a list? Have you identified places that are brownfields in? I'm wondering either on the for-profit side or the not-for-profit side. Are there programs out there that help people navigate these things and get a project from start to finish as it relates to the environmental?
Sure. So kind of on both parts, people ask us all the time, do I have a brownfield, or tell me how many sites are this? The databases we do have, the public databases, any site where we've obtained environmental data, where we've reviewed contamination reports, or we had to direct people for cleanup, like the site I referenced, the old gas station. Yes, we have a database of sites. We call it the contaminated sites database. Some aren't really all that contaminated, but they had a review under that authority. So those are in there. But the general descriptor, do I have a brownfield, or maybe like the city of Marshalltown or city of Ames? How many brownfields are there? That's in the eye of the beholder. The East Village in Des Moines could have contaminated sites. Are they brownfields? Likely not. Things are pretty hot in the East Village, and that's in a good way.
Yeah, right.
But if developers do see, well, I've got a site, it does have a history with DNR. There are going to be some speed bumps here. And other developers have said, no, forget it. There are some programs for assistance at the DNR. If you're a nonprofit developer, and there are some, there may be city, county-based Neighborhood Development Corporation in Des Moines is one. They're a nonprofit developer. We can help them with some grants to do assessments or some small grants for smaller cleanups. But larger developers, there are some tax credits available through the Iowa Economic Development Authority. And those are competitive, as a lot of, tax credits are. Sure. But if you have what I would call a good site, which means it's been sitting there latent and vacant.
A good bad site.
Yeah, a good bad site. Some people want those. Yep. The tax credit program IED can offer anywhere from a 12 to 24% tax credit reimbursement on your development project. All costs, demolition, renovation, environmental, and even new construction or remodeling, up to the potential for $1.5 million at the top end. So 12 to 24% up to $1.5 million.
Incredible.
That's worth talking about because banks will only loan so much.
Correct.
Banks don't like to loan on demolition or environmental cleanup, right?
Yep.
Yeah, they like to loan on new construction.
Correct.
So that program has been around for almost 20 years. Again, it's managed at IEDA, but we at the DNR, we are one of the, in essence, entities that helps review the tax credits. And I do that myself representing DNR. And I'm so happy that we can help invest in a lot of these projects. We've had projects from Dyersville to Dubuque and Denison and everywhere in between.
Well, it's tremendous work because there's a lot of projects. I can imagine a lot of sites that would just never get touched without some sort of assistance to be able to move that a little further along.
Yeah. I always say that the dollar assistance is helpful, but again, knowledge is power. Yeah. I've met some developers that the things we've just talked about, it was stuff they were scared of, frightened of. Once they figured it out, then with that confidence, they can make better informed risk evaluations and march this forward. Good consultants, and there is a role for a good environmental attorney. No sales pitch here for attorneys, but if you're dealing with certain properties, especially if they do have a history or they've been involved in larger federal regulatory history, the feds have what they call the Superfund program. Sites that, not to rub the term in, but the worst of the worst contaminated sites. Yep. If you're thinking about buying a Superfund site, you could potentially do that, but you're going to want to take your time and work with a good environmental attorney.
If somebody gets to that level, it's past a DNR at that point. You're into the Fed at that point.
Depending on what the situation is, a site that still has plenty of potential, now owned by the city of Des Moines, is what's called Dyko, right down there behind Meredith, right. On Fleur Drive at the Raccoon River. That's had federal oversight for over 45 years now. But the DNR has worked closely with the EPA, city of Des Moines, to get that site to move forward. And for those that have seen it in the past, drive by today, the buildings are now gone. Right. There's lots of discussion on some pretty nifty plans. Some of them are concepts. Some could come to pass, but there are ways, just like that used car, you can fix it, you can get value out of it, and you can move it down the road again. So I don't want people to be scared of those things. It's just the step-by-step approach.
How'd you get into this line of work?
Well, it's kind of funny you ask. I'm an urban planner by degree. While I was in school at Iowa State, you could kind of focus your planning studies, and there was transportation planning and historic preservation planning, neighborhood planning. I chose environmental policy as a track, and I was all set to go work at Polk County. I worked at their planning office all my summers in college. Unfortunately, there was a hiring freeze the spring I was graduating. There was a horse track where some bonds were due, and there were no table games yet.
Got it.
And obviously today that's a great success. But the job I was after that I pretty much thought I had a shoe in for, there was a hiring freeze. So with my environmental studies combined with my planning degree, there was a growing consulting firm in West Des Moines. There was a lot of underground storage tank work starting about 30 years ago. So I started working privately, dealt with the DNR a lot. Had to go down there for meetings a lot. And after about 5 years, I had a position and I'm like, hey, I'd love to not just help businesses, but serve the state of Iowa as a whole. So I've been there now for 28 years. Yep. It's been fun.
You grew up here in town or in Iowa? Yeah,
I was born in Des Moines, grew up south of town, a bit out in the country. So I always say I can talk urban or rural depending on my audience.
If you're a house flipper, execute the burst strategy, or do double closings and are in need of money, Little Guy Loans is your go-to lender here in the Des Moines area. Time is money. Loan approvals in 24 hours. Closings in 5 days. Little Guy Loans was founded by Neil Timmins, an investor just like you. Since he has been in over 10,000 homes in Des Moines, there's never an appraisal. Houses, multifamily, and commercial property loans up to $1 million. Check out www.littleguyloans.com.
I'm curious, what keeps you here? You could have done this anywhere. You chose to go to school here. You chose to stay here. Just to serve the state.
Yep.
Why? What drives that? What's the fuel?
Well, I was born and raised in Iowa, and people often say, Iowa, why do you live there? And my response is, I guess I was lucky to be born here. Iowa just was ranked by U.S. News and World Reports as the 6th best state in the United States to live in. We don't have mountains, we don't have a seashore, but we beat out some states that do. Quality of life is good here, affordability. education, lots of things. But basically, my family was here. And even working privately, my company wanted to send me to Texas. But I had established enough relationships with business people and just my pride in our state. I'm just kind of a stubborn, proud Midwesterner. So yeah, and Des Moines, if anybody has lived here for any length of time, I'm just amazed in the growth, certainly of the Des Moines metro area. I remember when the Ruan building was built, that was a big deal, especially since it was brown, rusty steel already the day it went up, right. On purpose. Right. But just the changes in the metro, including this was the end of town where we're sitting at your office.
Correct. Yes, at one point. It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. But my career at DNR, we have a great agency, great dedicated people, great leadership. It seems like yesterday that I started there. So if you like your job, time passes quickly.
There's no doubt about that. What has been one of the biggest changes since you've started to where things sit today? What have been a couple of the biggest changes that you've seen in the DNR, in the state, perhaps in the real estate development world? Maybe some of the interactions as it relates to the DNR or the perspective.
Boy, those are some good ones.
Yeah.
I could certainly ponder and probably come up with a list, but a couple ones that really stick out. It used to be like 20 years ago, we only thought about groundwater. Contamination in groundwater, an old gas station that leaks benzene, key component in gasoline, and it gets into a city well and people drink it. We don't want that. So a lot of the assessment work and risk evaluation was on groundwater protection. And certainly even today, that's obviously hugely important. But over time, it was realized, it's not just groundwater. Volatile chemicals in groundwater can vaporize. They turn into what we call vapor intrusion. So about 20 years ago, vapor intrusion became something, you may need to evaluate that. You may need to mitigate that. But in the last 5 years, PFAS or PFOS, one of the forever chemicals, it was used as a fire suppressant. It's slick. It was used in Teflon. In essence, a great chemical for the use it was intended for. Right. But it doesn't really go away. It doesn't break down in the environment. And by itself, in a small quantity, probably no worry. But if it would be in a drinking water supply in a concentration that somebody could have, let's say, what we call a chronic exposure, small amounts over time can lead to risk. So PFAS is probably what I would call the emerging contaminant. And under federal law, the current administration and the EPA, they are promulgating some standards here. So PFAS will be one of those contaminants that in a phase 2, if it was used or manufactured nearby, that's going to be one that's looked for. PFAS, polyfluoro. I can't tell you the rest because I can't remember.
Well, it's just like all things. There's an evolution. There's a science that continues to evolve. You continue to learn more, and as a result, policy changes.
Right. But generally speaking, I'd say 3 out of 4 brownfield sites don't have any issues at all. And that last quarter, it's just like kind of eating the elephant. You just start breaking it down. I've rarely seen a site that can't be safely redeveloped. So again, I don't want people to be scared. I just want them to be informed and kind of walk in with some good background. We have some fact sheets at DNR and some information. We can help explain everything from that groundwater hazard statement to how phase 1s and phase 2s work. So your customers and subscribers can reach out to us. We'd be glad to help them.
Excellent. Mel, are you ready for the final 3 questions?
Yes. I hope they're even more fun than these.
We're going to see. These are always exciting to me. If you had one piece of advice to your 20-year-old self, what would it be?
Oh my, that's a good one. It would be the advice that I was given by other older people. Honesty, hard work, and dedication. You show that at every level of anything you do, engaging with everyone. That's the best way to prepare yourself to be an adult and, frankly, to be successful. Yeah.
2 books that changed your life.
Oh, boy. That's an even better one. I would probably say Stephen Ambrose and his book, Citizen Soldiers, about the World War II soldiers, and it doesn't matter what era or what time, citizen soldier, think about the term. Difficult times in our nation. Average citizens stepped up, whether they were drafted or whether they signed up and volunteered, they went and served. And the citizen soldiers, they started our nation. Right. They defended our country, or, I guess the things we were supposed to be founded on in the Civil War, and defended our country in 2 world wars, a Cold War, and other things here in the last 30 years. So that's one book. And the second book, I would probably say Boy, that's a tough one to think through because I just love history so much. I'd probably say just read the Constitution. And that's not a red or a blue statement. Read the Constitution. People talk about the Constitution on both sides, but most of the time they don't understand what that amendment is.
It's for us.
And that's not a DNR statement.
All right. If you were cast away on an island.
Oh, man.
Yeah. You could only get 3 pieces of data about your business, what you do day in and day out. 3 pieces you could get each and every month to know how your business is running.
What
3 things?
Okay. I'll make it very general. It can still fit exactly what I do or what you do. Customer satisfaction.
Okay.
I do have people that call us at DNR. The way I help them, they may not like what I say. It may not be the answer they're looking for, but how you give them that information and how you help them, that's still important.
Yes.
You know, a doctor's bedside manner, no matter what they tell you, still important.
Correct.
So I'd probably say, customer feedback. And then, am I meeting my goals for either what's my profit margin or in my case, what am I here to do? What I'm here to do is help get those brownfield sites redeveloped. So I want my reports back on my metrics. Is my work making that difference? And then the third one, what kind of bonus do I get?
I love it. All right, Mel, I've asked tons of questions. What's one question I did not ask, but I should have asked?
Yeah, well, I would probably say this. When it comes to environmental data, I'll just kind of cover my bases on this. There is a lot of environmental assessment done in the state of Iowa. I know the DNR doesn't see every one that is done. Most of the time, residual contaminants can be found everywhere, but I do tell people, you know what? If you think you found something, there's an obligation in Iowa law to let us know. If somebody finds contamination where it could be an immediate or a likely hazardous condition, the Iowa law says you have to notify DNR. We've had people before that, well, our attorney says if we don't like the data, we can walk away from the deal. They can walk away. Nobody says anything. Sometimes those, what they call non-disclosure agreements, those really don't apply to state or federal law. So I always say when in doubt, it's better to report. And I'll leave you with this, another example, but change the names. I got a call on a Friday afternoon where a potential property developer said, well, I'm developing some farm ground and I found an old rusty drum. Is that a big deal? Said, is there any green ooze coming out of it? No. I said, those lay around on the barbed wire fence sides or the back 40 all the time. What if I found 2 or 3? Well, what's in them? Well, I don't know. Well, again, you know, if there's just a couple, 3 sitting around, still maybe no big deal. Well, what if there's like a dozen buried drums? I said, well, you know what? You probably want to call us. Yeah. So this was a Friday afternoon, and he said, thank you. They called Tuesday, and we found an illegal burial disposal site of some hazardous waste drums where a housing development was going to go in. We determined where that waste was originated. The company that generated the waste had followed everything they were supposed to. The person that illegally disposed of it was no longer around, like on the planet, but the company stepped up and said, hey, let's just get this figured out. It was solved within 2 weeks. Wow. So even with something like that, again, it's better to disclose, let us work with you, let's figure this out together. We aren't trying to come down like 1,000-pound sledgehammer on anyone. If you're trying to do the right thing, we're going to do the right thing with you.
Mel, for people, they want to find you, they want to follow you, they want to connect with you, where should they go? What should they do?
Yeah, couple easy ones. I'm Gen Xer, so the easiest one is call me. So Mel Pins, just like it sounds, P-I-N-S, DNR at 515-729-4616. If your podcast allows, I'll have my email address there. We have a general website at DNR. Type in brownfield, you can find me. And I'm also on LinkedIn with all my contact info.
Links and email addresses below in the show notes, everybody. Mel, I appreciate you coming in.
Thank you very much, Neil. Glad to be here.
Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the show, may I ask a favor of you? Naturally, subscribe so you never miss an episode. But would you rate and leave an honest written review on Apple Podcasts? It does a lot for us here at the show, and I appreciate reading your thoughts. Great guests make for a great show. If you know of another Iowan who would be a great guest, or you yourself have interest in being a guest, well, get on our radar. Visit Investing in Iowa to fill out an application or recommend a guest. And if you want to connect with me one-on-one, go to legacyimpactinvestors.com. Click on the Invest With Us button in the top right corner. And there you can pick a time for the two of us to get on the calendar and connect. Until next time, keep investing in Iowa.